fog had descended upon Whitechapel as it often did in the late autumn. It clung to the cobblestone streets like a blanket, swallowing up the cries of the street vendors and muffling the hurried footsteps of late-night workers returning home. The air was damp, and the gaslights flickered weakly, casting eerie shadows that twisted in the corners of alleyways. Inspector Robert Harris of Scotland Yard stood before the entrance of a decrepit townhouse on Princelet Street, his breath visible in the chilly air as he surveyed the scene. It was a crime unlike any he had seen before, a mystery that seemed unsolvable in its bizarre simplicity. The front door had been left ajar, the only sign of intrusion being the faint scuff marks on the polished wooden floor inside. But what truly puzzled him was the body, or rather, the absence of it. In the center of the room was a chair, its back to the door, and resting on it was a neatly folded letter. The strange part was that the letter was addressed to Harris, written in a flowing feminine hand. "I have seen what you cannot," it read. "Follow the shadows, Inspector." Harris had examined the scene for hours, but there were no fingerprints, no signs of forced entry, no indication of a struggle. It was as though the person had simply vanished, leaving only the cryptic note behind. It made no sense. No one had seen or heard anything. The house was deserted, save for the lone chair and the shadow that seemed to cling to the walls, refusing to dissipate despite the flickering gaslight. A faint creak of the floorboards behind him broke Harris's concentration. He turned swiftly, his hand instinctively reaching for his revolver. But it was only Miss Jane Marple standing in the doorway, her keen eyes twinkling with that familiar sharpness. Despite her years, her presence was always a welcome one, particularly in cases like this, where logic seemed to have been discarded entirely. "I see you're still here, Inspector," she said with a soft smile, stepping into the room with the grace of someone who had seen far more than the average person would care to imagine. "Miss Marple," Harris nodded. "I didn't expect you to come. All the way from St. Mary Mead for this. I thought you'd be busy with your own matters." "Crime never rests, Robert," she replied, her voice steady as ever. "And neither does my curiosity. May I take a look?" Without waiting for his response, she crossed the room, her feet moving with quiet precision as she bent down to inspect the chair, her eyes tracing the faint marks on the floor, the pattern of the shadows against the wall, and then, most notably, the letter. "It's rather odd, isn't it?" she mused. "The letter seems to be addressed to you, yet it doesn't explain anything. A clue, but also a riddle hidden in plain sight. The shadows, they seem important. And what of the chair? No struggle, no indication of violence, just emptiness." Harris felt a twinge of frustration. Miss Marple's calm demeanor was a stark contrast to his own growing unease. "The missing person, Miss Marple, is Emily Cartwright. The last to see her alive was her maid, who swears Emily was in her room earlier this evening. But when we arrived, there was no one. No signs of a struggle, just this note and the chair. And now, nothing." Miss Marple nodded, her fingers tracing the edge of the letter with the same meticulous care she gave to all things. "I don't believe the letter is meant to mislead, Robert. It's a message, but it's not the only message here." "Then what is?" "The shadows," she repeated softly. "They are not just something to observe. I believe they're the key to understanding this crime." Harris raised an eyebrow, his thoughts racing. He had always admired Miss Marple's ability to find connections where others saw only chaos. But this was unlike any case he had ever encountered. "You're suggesting something supernatural?" "No," she answered firmly. What we are dealing with is not ghosts, but something much more human in nature. The shadows are not what they appear to be. She stood and turned to face him. Have you searched the other rooms of the house? I have. Everything is clean, too clean, almost as if someone had planned for us to find it this way. Of course. Miss Marple's eyes flicked to the walls again, studying the faint patterns of darkness that clung to the corners, growing deeper as the gaslight flickered. It's the arrangement of the room that holds the answer. We must pay closer attention to the space between the light and dark. They began their search anew, this time focused not on the obvious, but on the subtle. It was in the way the shadows seemed to shift when they moved closer to the walls, in the faint, almost imperceptible change in the angles as the gaslight trembled. Harris stepped closer to the far corner of the room, where the shadows seemed most intense. At first, he thought it was just the uneven light casting strange shapes, but then he noticed something more, something out of place. A small, nearly invisible crack in the wall, barely perceptible unless you were standing directly in front of it. Miss Marple, come here, he called softly. She approached him, her eyes narrowing as she too noticed the crack. Fascinating. A hidden door, perhaps. With a careful push, Harris slid the hidden panel open, revealing a narrow staircase descending into darkness. It led beneath the house, into the depths of a space that had clearly been sealed for years. No one had thought to check for secret passages. It had been too simple, too unremarkable, and thus it had been overlooked. Without hesitation, they descended, their footsteps muffled by the thick layer of dust that had settled over the stairs. At the bottom, the air grew colder, the oppressive darkness pressing in on them. The room they entered was sparse, almost clinical in its emptiness. But at its center stood something that took Harris's breath away, a woman's silhouette, barely visible in the dim light. The figure was hunched over, her body almost completely obscured by the shadows. As they approached, Miss Marple spoke softly, her voice both calm and authoritative. You wanted us to find you, didn't you, Miss Cartwright? The figure stirred and slowly turned, her face emerging from the darkness. Emily Cartwright, pale and thin, appeared as though she had been living in the shadows for far too long. You found me, she whispered, her voice brittle. But I am not the one who needs saving. Emily Cartwright's words hung in the air like a cryptic whisper, unsettling in their calmness. Miss Marple stepped forward, her eyes soft yet unyielding, as she observed the woman before her. Harris, standing behind her, was silent, still absorbing the weight of their discovery. It wasn't just the secret room that unnerved him now, but the sense of familiarity it had with other cases he had seen, cases where the truth was twisted and hidden behind layers of manipulation. Who are you hiding from? Harris finally asked, his voice edged with both concern and suspicion. He was still trying to piece together the puzzle, but Emily's frail presence only deepened the mystery. The woman looked down at the floor, her long, disheveled hair hiding most of her face. It's not me you need to worry about, she murmured, as though she were speaking more to herself than to them. It's them, the ones who made this happen, the ones who left the shadows to watch. Miss Marple tilted her head, as if she were considering something beyond the immediate response. You've been here for a long time, haven't you, Miss Cartwright? In this room, hidden away. Emily nodded slowly, her lips trembling. Yes. I had to leave. I had to disappear. They made it so I could never leave. And now, they're coming for me again." Harris's brow furrowed. "But who are they, Miss Cartwright? What do you mean by shadows?" Emily's hands gripped the edge of the stone wall beside her, her eyes darting to the door behind them. "You won't believe me," she said softly. "But they were always there, watching, waiting for me to make the wrong move." Miss Marple exchanged a glance with Harris. "Perhaps we should start with what's missing, Inspector," she suggested. "What was it that led you to this place? What made you so certain of her disappearance?" Harris hesitated, but he knew that Miss Marple was right. He turned his attention back to the room, his eyes now scanning it with fresh determination. Everything here seemed so meticulously placed, as though someone had tried to make it appear ordinary, even though it clearly wasn't. Then something caught his eye. A small, insignificant detail. A single, perfectly polished cufflink, half hidden, under the edge of a loose floorboard. It was strange enough to make him pause. It didn't belong here, not in this decaying room, and certainly not in the hands of someone like Emily Cartwright. The cufflink wasn't hers. Harris bent down to retrieve it, his fingers brushing against the smooth metal. The design was simple, an engraving of an ornate crest, the kind one might find on a man's high-end suit. A family crest, perhaps. "You recognize this, Miss Cartwright?" Harris asked, holding the cufflink up for her to see. Her eyes widened for a split second, and then she quickly looked away, an almost imperceptible flicker of panic crossing her face before she regained her composure. I don't know," she stammered, her voice tinged with a nervous tremor. "It's not mine. It must have been left here before." Harris narrowed his gaze. There it was, the first sign of deception. The way Emily had reacted was telling. It wasn't just fear. It was an instinctual attempt to hide something. But what? Miss Marple, ever the keen observer, was already piecing the scene together in her mind. "Inspector, let us not be distracted by the small details," she said softly, as though guiding him to a deeper truth. "The cufflink is important, yes, but we must remember why it's here. This room, the shadows, and the cryptic clues left for you, they're all part of the same puzzle." "But what does it mean?" Harris asked, his voice frustrated. "I'm missing something, Miss Marple. Why would she react this way?" Miss Marple placed a hand on his arm, her touch light but reassuring. "You're thinking too much about the object itself. It's the person it belongs to who holds the key." The words hung in the air, and Harris felt a sudden, unnerving sense of clarity. It wasn't just the cufflink. It was the person it symbolized. Someone who wasn't supposed to be part of this puzzle. Someone who had been hiding in plain sight, masked by deception. "Miss Cartwright," he began, turning back to her with renewed focus. "Who does this belong to? This cufflink? It's not a coincidence." Emily's face paled, her hands trembling as she stepped back. "I don't know," she whispered again, her voice nearly cracking. "I've told you all I know. Please, you have to believe me." Harris's patience was wearing thin, but Miss Marple's calm presence kept him grounded. She took a step forward, her eyes never leaving Emily's face. "Inspector," she said quietly, "let's consider the possibility that Miss Cartwright is telling us the truth. But perhaps there's someone else who knows more. Someone who may have been involved in her disappearance." The weight of the realization hit Harris like a hammer. Someone else had to be involved. Someone who had used Emily's fear to manipulate the situation. They had made it seem as though she had vanished of her own accord, but in reality she had been hidden away, forced into isolation by a figure who had controlled every aspect of her life. His thoughts turned back to the note, the one left behind, in the chair. "Follow the shadows, Inspector." That wasn't a directive, it was a warning. "Miss Cartwright," he said, his voice firm but still compassionate. "I need you to trust me. There's someone, isn't there? Someone who's been behind this all along. They must have been controlling you, keeping you from telling us the truth." Emily trembled, her eyes darting between them. "I can't," she gasped. "If I tell you, they'll come for me again. They'll kill me this time." Miss Marple stepped forward, her eyes unwavering. "Then we'll stop them, Miss Cartwright. We'll make sure they never reach you." But as she spoke, Harris's attention was diverted by a soft sound behind him. It was faint but unmistakable. A light creak, as though someone, or something, had just moved within the shadows. The room seemed to tighten around them, the darkness seeping in once more, just as it had before. "Inspector," Miss Marple said, her voice steady but urgent, "you're not alone in this room." The shadow had returned. The air in the hidden room was thick with tension, as though the very walls were pressing in, forcing the truth to surface. Harris stood still, listening intently, but the faint creak had ceased, leaving only the distant hum of the night beyond. The shadows in the corners seemed to stretch even further now, as if mocking the fragile light they had left behind. Miss Marple's sharp gaze never wavered from Emily Cartwright, who had gone utterly still, her breath shallow as she took in the unspoken warning in the room. "Inspector, perhaps we should step outside," Miss Marple suggested, her voice calm, though her eyes held a certain urgency. "This room has grown too heavy with secrets. The truth will come, but not under this oppressive weight." Harris nodded, his gut telling him that something was amiss, but he had yet to figure out exactly what. He gestured for Emily to move toward the door, his mind racing with the cryptic messages and the unsettling silence that had enveloped them since their arrival. Once they were back outside, in the cool night air, Harris took a deep breath. The fog had thickened, but there was no time to dwell on the surroundings. He needed answers, real ones. "Miss Cartwright," he began, his voice firm but not unkind, "we need you to tell us everything you know. There are too many inconsistencies here, and your silence won't protect you any longer. Whoever's hiding in the shadows is using you, and we need to find them." Emily looked at him, her eyes wide with fear. "I've told you all I know, Inspector. I don't have anything else to say. Please, just let me go." Before Harris could respond, Miss Marple spoke softly, her gaze distant as though already contemplating the next piece of the puzzle. "Robert, let us start with the witnesses. We've already seen what Miss Cartwright is willing to share, but perhaps we should talk to others. They might know something we've missed." Harris turned to Miss Marple, seeing the quiet certainty in her eyes. "You're right. We need to get to the bottom of this. I'll arrange for the maid to be questioned." The maid, a woman by the name of Sarah Trenton, was waiting for them back at the station. She was visibly nervous, wringing her hands together as she sat across from them. The dim light from the oil lamp flickered in the small, cramped room where they had been seated. Her eyes darted between Harris and Miss Marple, her lips trembling. "Sarah," Harris began, "we need to know exactly what happened the night Miss Cartwright disappeared. Tell us what you saw." The maid hesitated for a moment, her face pale as she looked down at her hands. I don't know much, sir. I only know what I heard." She looked up, her voice cracking. Miss Cartwright. She seemed so strange that night. She was restless, pacing about her room, talking to herself. I didn't think anything of it at first, but then she left. I didn't see her go, but I heard the door creak open. I tried to follow, but when I opened the door, she was gone. I couldn't find her anywhere. "Did you see anyone else in the house?" Harris asked, keeping his tone measured, even though a growing sense of unease gripped him. Sarah paused. "No, sir. Just her. I didn't see anyone else leave. And I didn't hear anything more. She stopped abruptly, her eyes wide, a sudden flush of guilt crossing her face. "What is it, Sarah?" Miss Marple asked, her voice soft but insistent. The maid looked around, her eyes flitting nervously between the two of them. "There's something else. Something I didn't tell anyone before. That night, just before she left, I saw something. A figure in the hallway, just outside her room. It wasn't clear, but I swear it was there. Watching her." Harris leaned forward, his interest piqued. "What did the figure look like? Can you describe it?" Sarah shook her head, her expression filled with confusion. "No, it was too dark. I couldn't make out any details, but I know I saw something, and I heard whispers too. Strange, distant whispers, like someone was trying to hide." Miss Marple exchanged a glance with Harris, a thoughtful frown forming on her face. "Sarah, did anyone else in the house ever speak of hearing these whispers? Were there any other signs of unusual activity?" The maid nodded a little too quickly. "Yes. Mrs. Cartwright, Miss Emily's mother, she mentioned hearing voices too, but she said it was just the wind, nothing to worry about. But I heard it, and I know what I heard." "Anything else, Sarah?" Harris pressed, sensing that she was holding back more than she was letting on. The maid's eyes flickered toward the door, as though she were expecting someone to enter at any moment. She swallowed hard. "I just want to leave this place. I don't want to be here anymore." Harris stood, his mind spinning as he exchanged another glance with Miss Marple. "Thank you, Sarah. We'll get to the bottom of this." As Sarah hurried out of the room, Miss Marple remained seated, her eyes thoughtful. "There are contradictions in what she's said, Robert. She's clearly nervous, but something is off. The way she hesitated before mentioning the figure in the hallway, it doesn't sit right." Harris nodded. "Agreed. But it's the whispers I find troubling. They sound like something more than just nerves. Someone else was in that house, someone who may have known Emily's every move." "Indeed," Miss Marple mused, her expression unreadable. "There are hidden motives here, Robert. The maid is afraid, but she's also hiding something. It's more than just fear of the shadows. She's afraid of something, someone. We'll need to dig deeper, find out more about her relationships with the family." Before they could continue their conversation, another figure arrived at the station. A man, in his late 40s, dressed in a dark, nondescript suit. His demeanor was calm, almost too calm, as he introduced himself as Charles Henley, an old acquaintance of the Cartwright family. He had been the one to notify the authorities of Emily's disappearance, though his involvement seemed minimal, even distant. "Inspector Harris, Miss Marple," he said smoothly, his voice low and controlled. "I came as soon as I heard about Miss Cartwright. I fear the worst has happened." Harris studied him carefully, noting the stiffness in his posture and the forced sincerity in his tone. "Mr. Henley, you knew the Cartwrights well?" "Yes," Henley replied. his eyes glinting momentarily with something unreadable. "I've been friends with the family for many years. We were close once, but things have changed over time." "How so?" Harris pressed, the hairs on the back of his neck standing on end as he listened closely to the man's words. Henley paused, his eyes darting to the door, then to Miss Marple. "There were complications, personal matters. Miss Cartwright was always a delicate creature, you understand? Easily influenced, too trusting of others. The shift in his demeanor was subtle, but it didn't escape Harris's notice." "And what about these complications? What kind of personal matters are you referring to, Mr. Henley?" Henley's lips tightened. "It's nothing that should concern you, Inspector. I just wanted to offer my condolences and ensure that Miss Cartwright is found safe." Harris knew there was more to this story. Henley was hiding something, and it was only a matter of time before the truth would surface. Harris stared at Charles Henley, his mind whirling with questions. The man's smooth exterior and carefully measured words only served to deepen Harris's suspicions. Something was amiss, but what? Henley's ties to the Cartwright family were clearly more complex than he was letting on, and there was no telling how far the web of deception stretched. Miss Marple, ever observant, leaned in slightly, as though contemplating the subtleties of Henley's demeanor. "You've known the family a long time, Mr. Henley," she said, her voice light, almost conversational. "I imagine you've seen more than a few changes over the years." Henley's face tightened imperceptibly, though he maintained his composure. "Yes, Miss Marple, the Cartwrights have seen their share of challenges, as most families do. But I assure you, my interest in their current situation is purely out of concern for Emily. She was a troubled soul." "Troubled souls often find themselves in dangerous situations, don't they?" Miss Marple's tone was calm, but there was a sharpness behind her words that hinted at the undercurrent of suspicion. Harris felt a chill run down his spine. Henley's lips pressed into a thin line, but before he could respond, Harris interrupted. "Mr. Henley, you mentioned complications earlier. What exactly did you mean by that? Is there something you're not telling us?" Henley shifted uncomfortably in his seat, his eyes momentarily darting to the door, as though looking for an escape. It's not my place to say," he said finally, his voice tight. "But I will say this. The Cartwrights have never been what they appeared to be. There are things about their past that they would rather remain buried." Harris leaned forward, sensing that Henley was close to revealing something significant. "What kinds of things?" he pressed. "Are you suggesting there's something in Emily's past that might explain her disappearance?" Henley hesitated, then seemed to come to a decision. He looked around the room again before speaking, his voice dropping to a whisper. "There are rumors, Inspector. Whispers about a financial scandal that nearly destroyed the family years ago. It's said that Emily's father, Samuel Cartwright, was involved in some sort of shady dealings. The details are murky, but there's no mistaking the tension that came with it. If Emily found out the truth, if she uncovered something, it could explain why she left." Miss Marple's eyes narrowed as she absorbed this information. "A scandal, you say? And you think Emily stumbled upon it?" Henley nodded, his face grim. "It's possible. Emily was always more perceptive than people gave her credit for. She was bright, perhaps too bright for her own good." Harris felt the pieces of the puzzle starting to shift. Financial scandal, family secrets, a woman caught in the middle of something far larger than herself. It was starting to make sense, But there were too many gaps in the story, too many unanswered questions. "We need to speak to Samuel Cartwright," Harris said, his voice firm. "If there's any truth to this scandal, he'll know more." Henley stiffened at the mention of Cartwright's name, but he didn't offer any further objections. Instead, he stood up, offering a stiff bow. "As you wish, Inspector, but be careful. Samuel Cartwright is a man with his own complicated history. He's not someone you want to provoke." After Henley left, Harris and Miss Marple exchanged a glance. The former's mind was working overtime, connecting dots, testing theories. There was something off about Henley's eagerness to distance himself from the situation. Perhaps he was more involved than he let on, or perhaps he was simply trying to protect someone else. "We need to focus on the motives," Miss Marple said, breaking Harris out of his thoughts. "Greed, revenge, jealousy, fear even. They all play a part in this web, but no single theory explains everything. We must look at each person's actions carefully and piece it together, one thread at a time." Harris nodded slowly. "Right. Let's start with Samuel Cartwright." The elder Cartwright's house was an imposing estate, nestled on the outskirts of town, its large windows and dark stone walls giving off an air of both wealth and isolation. Samuel Cartwright himself was a man of imposing presence, tall with a sharp jawline that seemed to have been carved from stone, his eyes cold and calculating. He greeted Harris and Miss Marple with a curt nod, his hand stiff as he offered them a seat in his grand study. "You've come about my daughter," he said, his voice as clipped and controlled as his demeanor. "I assume you've learned all you need to know. She's gone, and I don't know where she's gone. It's as simple as that." Miss Marple studied him carefully. "Mr. Cartwright, I must ask, what about the rumors of a financial scandal? Is it true that you were involved in some questionable dealings in the past?" Samuel Cartwright's expression didn't change, but there was a flicker of something, regret perhaps, or fear behind his eyes. "Those rumors are nothing more than that. Rumors. My business dealings are my own, Miss Marple. I've always protected my family from such nonsense. But you couldn't protect Emily from the truth, could you?" Miss Marple's voice was soft, but her words cut through the thick tension in the room. Harris watched closely, sensing that the old man's defenses were beginning to crumble. Cartwright's face darkened. "I didn't want her to know," he admitted, his voice low. "But she was curious. Too curious. I tried to keep her out of it, but she wouldn't listen. She dug into my past, into things that I had worked hard to keep buried. When she found out, I don't know what she was planning, but I feared she would expose everything." Harris leaned forward. "And you think she ran off because of this?" Cartwright's gaze flickered toward the window, his mind clearly far away. "I didn't know what she would do. I tried to warn her, tried to keep her safe. But I couldn't protect her from everything. And now I don't know where she is." Harris pressed on. "Do you think someone else was involved in her disappearance? Could someone have taken advantage of her?" Cartwright's lips curled into a thin smile, but it was a smile without humor. "Perhaps. People are always looking to exploit others, especially when there's money involved. But I'm not the one you should be questioning. You should be looking closer to home, at the people who were closest to her. Look at the ones she trusted." Harris felt a sharp sting of realization. The family, the servants, even Henley, everyone had motives. Everyone had a reason to be involved. But that didn't explain everything. There were too many contradictions, too many lies. The deeper they dug, the more the pieces seemed to shift, always just out of reach. As he left Cartwright's house, Harris's mind was a whirlpool of suspicion and doubt. Greed, revenge, jealousy, fear. Each one was a plausible motive. But who among them was hiding the truth? And how could he untangle the web before someone else fell victim to its deadly strands? He looked at Miss Marple, who was deep in thought. "I'm starting to see the connections," Harris said, his voice grim. "But there's still one piece missing, one final link that will tie it all together." Miss Marple smiled faintly. "And we'll find it, Inspector. We'll find it soon enough." The following morning, Harris found himself standing in the dimly lit hallway of the Cartwright estate, a letter clutched tightly in his hand. The discovery had come as a shock, a carefully written note, found hidden beneath a floorboard in the study, signed with an unfamiliar name. It was a confession of sorts, albeit vague, alluding to the financial scandal and some sort of unspoken threat against Emily Cartwright. It seemed too perfect, too neatly placed. It was almost as if someone wanted him to find it. "This changes everything," Harris muttered, his eyes scanning the letter again. "It's a confession. It's got to be." Miss Marple stood beside him, her calm gaze unwavering. "I wouldn't be so quick to jump to conclusions, Robert. The easy answer is often the wrong one." Harris felt the tension coil in his stomach. He had been here before, too many times in his career, seeing what seemed like the solution turn out to be nothing but a carefully laid trap. But still, the letter felt like a breakthrough. The handwriting seemed authentic, the fear palpable.
"In its words. Could be someone in the family wrote it," he said, rubbing his temple. "Trying to throw us off the scent." Miss Marple shook her head slowly. "Or it could be someone else entirely. But we must not let this lead cloud our judgment."
"Let's take it to the authorities and we'll see how they respond." With a feeling of growing certainty, they made their way to the police station. The weight of the letter in his hand felt almost unbearable, as though it carried the answers to everything. It was a breakthrough, no doubt about it. But was it the right one? Once inside, Harris wasted no time. He presented the letter to Inspector Collins, who looked it over with a raised eyebrow. "Well, this certainly seems to confirm everything we suspected, doesn't it? A confession from the very person we were looking for. Perhaps we can finally call this case closed." Harris couldn't shake the unease gnawing at him. Collins seemed far too eager to believe the confession, and in his experience that was never a good sign. People didn't usually confess so neatly. They didn't leave behind evidence wrapped in a bow. "I don't know, Collins," Harris said, his voice tight. "It's all a little too clean, too convenient." Collins shrugged, still scanning the letter. "What's the harm in following this lead? It may not be perfect, but it's something." Harris watched him for a moment before speaking again. "I think we should hold off, just for a bit. We've come this far, haven't we? Let's dig a little deeper before we jump to conclusions." Collins raised an eyebrow, clearly irritated by Harris's skepticism. "And how long are we supposed to wait then? Emily Cartwright is gone, and we've got someone admitting to their involvement. I'd say we've got enough to wrap this up." Miss Marple's voice cut through the tension like a knife. "There is no such thing as enough in matters like this. Inspector, we must be absolutely certain, or else we risk overlooking the real culprit. Sometimes the answer is hidden right before our eyes, disguised as the obvious." Collins looked between them, clearly frustrated, but the quiet wisdom in Miss Marple's words held him back from pressing further. Harris could see the battle inside. His mind, a part of him wanting to take the easy victory, and another part hesitating just as Harris had. He didn't want to rush this. Not now. "We'll hold off on the announcement," Harris said firmly. "But I'm not closing the case yet. We need more." Collins didn't look pleased, but gave a stiff nod, evidently willing to humor Harris for the time being. "Fine. But you're not going to like it when this blows up in your face." As Harris and Miss Marple left the station, the unease didn't dissipate. It settled deeper, like a heavy weight in his chest. The confession was just too perfect. It had the marks of a setup all over it, almost like someone wanted them to follow the trail. But why? What was the purpose of guiding them down this path? "Something's wrong," Harris said under his breath as they walked through the crowded streets. "It feels wrong." Miss Marple was quiet for a moment, her steps slow and deliberate as she considered his words. "Perhaps it's time we take another look at the people involved. Not just the family, the servants, Henley, even the others around her. What do they know that we haven't uncovered yet?" Harris nodded, though he couldn't shake the thought that the truth was slipping just out of reach, like a shadow in the fog. "We'll start with Henley. If anyone has the answers, it's him." They returned to Henley's estate later that afternoon, the air thick with the weight of their suspicions. Harris was determined to get to the bottom of the mystery, but as he and Miss Marple stood in front of Henley's imposing door, he couldn't shake the feeling that the closer they came to the truth, the more it slipped through their fingers. Henley greeted them at the door with an air of feigned cordiality. "Inspector, Miss Marple, I didn't expect to see you again so soon. I trust you found what you're looking for." Harris wasted no time in presenting the letter. "This was found at the Cartwright estate. It's a confession, Mr. Henley. Do you have any idea what to make of it?" Henley's eyes widened for the briefest of moments, a flicker of genuine surprise crossing his face. He quickly masked it, however, offering a nervous chuckle. "A confession, you say? How convenient. It's almost too easy, isn't it?" Harris narrowed his eyes. "You don't seem shocked by this, Mr. Henley, almost as though you were expecting it." Henley's smile faltered, and for the first time, Harris saw a crack in the man's perfect facade. I don't know what you mean," he stammered, his voice faltering just slightly. "Let's cut to the chase," Harris said, his voice low and steady. "We know that you were close to Emily. We know you were involved with the family long before the disappearance, and we know that you've been hiding something. What's your role in this?" Henley swallowed hard, his face suddenly pale. "I had nothing to do with it, I swear. He stopped, clearly realizing that his words were only making him seem more suspicious. "Look, all I know is that Emily, she was in danger. She knew too much. I tried to warn her." Harris pressed on. "Warn her about what?" Henley's gaze dropped to the floor, and for a long moment he said nothing. Then, almost as if he couldn't stop himself, he spoke. "I didn't think she'd go this far, but someone else, someone who knew what she was getting into, was pulling the strings. The real danger wasn't just the family secrets. It was someone who had something to lose if Emily exposed the truth." Harris felt a chill run through him. The confession had been a lie. It had been designed to throw them off course. And now, Henley's words confirmed it. The real criminal was still out there, hidden in the shadows, waiting for the right moment to strike. "Who was it, Henley?" Harris asked, his voice hard. "Who's pulling the strings?" Henley opened his mouth to speak, but the words never came. Instead, there was a loud crash from behind him, a shadow darting past the door. The figure was gone before Harris could react, but he knew, with chilling certainty, that they had just missed their chance. The real game had only just begun. Harris stood frozen at the door, his hand still hovering over the brass handle, heart pounding in his chest. The fleeting figure that had dashed past him was no ordinary shadow. It was a deliberate movement, a person who had been waiting for the right moment to slip away unnoticed. Henley was still standing in the doorway, his face ashen, his eyes wide with the same realization that was dawning on Harris. "Did you see that?" Henley whispered, his voice barely audible. Harris didn't respond at first. He was too caught up in the sudden burst of understanding. The slip of movement, the sudden urgency, it all felt too deliberate, too orchestrated. Someone had known they were coming. Someone had been waiting for them to show up, to ask the right questions. And now, the shadows had closed in. Miss Marple, her eyes sharp as ever, was already moving. "We need to follow them," she said quietly, her voice cutting through the tension like a thread unraveling. Harris turned to Henley, who was still rooted in place. "Who was that, Henley?" he demanded. "What's going on here?" Henley opened his mouth to speak, but his words faltered. Instead, he backed away from the door, shaking his head as though caught between fear and some unspoken knowledge he couldn't bring himself to voice. "I don't know who it was," he said at last, his voice thick with a mix of guilt and dread. "But you have to understand, this is all tied together. It's not just about Emily. This goes deeper than the family secrets." Harris pressed him further. "Then tell me what you know, Henley. Now." Henley hesitated, eyes darting between Harris and Miss Marple, as if searching for a way out. Finally, he seemed to come to some decision, his shoulders slumping. "There's more to the Cartwright family than anyone realizes, more than Emily realized." Miss Marple stepped forward, her calm presence a stark contrast to the rising tension. "What do you mean? What's been hidden all these years?" Henley swallowed hard, his gaze flicking nervously to the hallway behind him. "It's not just a financial scandal. It's the family's connection to something older, something darker." "Go on," Harris urged, his voice tight. Henley glanced over his shoulder, and for a moment it seemed as though he was debating whether or not to continue. Finally, he stepped into the hallway and motioned for them to follow. "There's a case from years ago," he said in a low voice, leading them further into the house. "One that's been buried by the family ever since. It was an accident, they said, but there are things about it that never made sense." Harris's mind immediately shifted into overdrive. Another case. Something from the past that had been long forgotten. What was it? Henley paused in front of a small study at the back of the house, glancing nervously at the door before pushing it open. He motioned for them to step inside. The room was dimly lit, the shelves lined with old books, papers scattered across a large desk. On the far wall, a portrait of a woman stared down at them, a beautiful young woman with sharp eyes and a sorrowful expression. The face was familiar, but Harris couldn't quite place it. "This is Eleanor Cartwright," Henley said, gesturing to the portrait. "Emily's aunt. She died over 20 years ago. Or so the family said." Harris felt a stir of recognition in his gut. Eleanor Cartwright. The name had surfaced during his early research, but he hadn't paid much attention to it. What connection could she have to the current case? She was the first to dig too deep into the family's business, Henley continued. Eleanor was never satisfied with the way things were, especially when it came to her brother, Samuel. She started asking questions about their father's will, about some of the darker dealings that had happened long before anyone else even knew about them. Emily reminded me so much of her, always searching for something, truth maybe, but more likely something dangerous. Harris stared at the portrait again, the unsettling feeling growing. And she died because of it? Henley's lips twisted into a grimace. Not directly, but it was an accident. At least that's what the family insisted. She was found in the woods behind the estate, her body broken and bloodied, like she'd fallen from a great height. They ruled it a suicide. Too much pressure from the family secrets, they said. But I know better. She wasn't the type to give up. She knew too much, and she was determined to expose it. Harris's eyes narrowed. You think she was murdered? Henley's voice dropped to a whisper. I'm sure of it, and I think someone in that family had a hand in it. Miss Marple, who had been listening intently, now stepped forward. And you believe that Emily uncovered something about Eleanor's death? That's why she was in danger? Henley nodded grimly. Exactly. Emily was starting to ask the same questions, Miss Marple. She was getting too close to the truth about Eleanor. She found out something that no one wanted her to know, and I fear it cost her everything. Harris ran a hand through his hair, his mind racing. Eleanor's death, the family secrets, the mysterious letter, it all seemed to point back to something ancient, something hidden beneath the surface of the Cartwright legacy. And yet, the more he uncovered, the more tangled the web became. He turned to Henley, his eyes sharp. If you knew all this, why didn't you come forward sooner? Henley winced. I tried. But you don't understand, Inspector. The Cartwrights are powerful people. Even someone like me can't stand up to them without risk. I thought I could help Emily from the shadows, but she was already too deep. I couldn't protect her. Harris turned away from Henley, his thoughts churning. The investigation had taken a turn that he hadn't expected. The crime wasn't just about a missing woman. It was about a legacy, a family built on lies, and a tragedy buried so deep that no one had bothered to unearth it until now. Miss Marple's voice broke through his thoughts. The connections are becoming clearer, aren't they, Robert? The past is always with us, lingering in the shadows, guiding the present. Harris nodded, his eyes narrowing as the pieces clicked into place. Eleanor's death wasn't an isolated incident. It was the first in a series of events that led to Emily's disappearance. Miss Marple's expression softened. It's a tangled web, to be sure, but we're getting closer, bit by bit. Harris glanced back at Henley, who was watching them with a mixture of anxiety and relief. We need to find out who was involved in Eleanor's death. Only then can we understand what's happening now. Henley hesitated but nodded. I'll help you, Inspector. But be careful. The shadows of the past are never as distant as we like to believe. Harris turned toward the door, his mind already racing ahead, the truth now more elusive than ever. The past had a way of resurfacing when least expected, and as the investigation deepened, he couldn't shake the feeling that they were about to uncover something far darker than anyone could have imagined. The sun had begun to dip beneath the horizon, casting a soft amber glow over the landscape as Harris, Miss Marple, and Henley sat around a small, cluttered table in Henley's study. The walls were lined with bookshelves, heavy with dusty volumes, and a faint smell of tobacco lingered in the air. The atmosphere was thick with anticipation, each of them aware that they were on the cusp of a breakthrough, but none of them could yet see the way forward. Harris's mind was buzzing with possibilities. The more he thought about Eleanor's death and Emily's disappearance, the more convinced he became that there was something deeply psychological at play, something hidden beneath the surface of this tangled family history. It was a game of manipulation, of lies told so skillfully that even the truth itself was distorted. He needed to approach this from a different angle, something that would reveal a subtle crack in the facade. Miss Marple, ever perceptive, had already picked up on his unease. "You're thinking, Robert," she said quietly, her tone suggesting that she understood exactly where his mind was going. "Something more than just the facts is at work here." He nodded. "Yes. The more we dig, the more I'm convinced that the real truth isn't going to be found in a straightforward confession or a physical clue. It's in the psychology of the people involved." Henley, who had been pacing nervously at the far side of the room, stopped and turned to them. "What do you mean? You think someone's playing us?" Harris looked him in the eye, his voice low. "I don't just think it, Henley. I know it. There's manipulation at play here. Someone is hiding something beneath the surface. And the key to uncovering that lies in understanding how these people think." He glanced at Miss Marple, who gave him a small nod of approval. Harris had been mulling over an unconventional tactic for some time now, something psychological, something that would force a reaction from the people involved, reveal a crack in their otherwise composed facades. It was risky, but it was the only way he saw forward. "I think it's time for a test," he said, his eyes narrowing. "A test of character." Henley frowned. "What do you mean by that? You're not going to accuse someone else based on some guess, are you?" "No," Harris said, shaking his head. "I'm going to make them believe we've already solved it. I want to see how they react, who shows fear, who cracks under pressure, and who tries to overplay their hand." Miss Marple regarded him carefully. "You're thinking of using a bluff to see who's hiding something?" Harris nodded. "Exactly. We'll make them believe we've uncovered something concrete, something they didn't expect. We'll test their reactions and see who slips up. This isn't about evidence anymore. It's about psychology." Henley, still looking wary, took a seat at the table. "And how are you going to do that?" "I've already got an idea," Harris said, standing and pacing in front of the window, the light now fading into a muted twilight. "The confession letter. It was too perfect, too easy. We'll use that as a basis, but I'll twist the narrative, just enough to make it seem like we know more than we actually do." Miss Marple watched him intently, her expression one of quiet approval. "It's a risky move, Robert, but sometimes the most direct approach is the one that works best." The detective took a deep breath, then set about putting his plan into motion. He sent word to the Cartwrights and their circle, requesting another round of questioning. This time he made it clear that they had made a significant discovery, a development so important that it would change the course of the investigation entirely. He knew they would all come to him with a mix of curiosity and anxiety, and it was the latter that he would exploit. It wasn't long before the first to arrive was none other than Jonathan Cartwright, Emily's cousin and the youngest member of the family. He was clearly on edge, his usual smug confidence replaced by a nervous energy that seemed to pulse through him as he walked into the room. "Inspector Harris, Miss Marple," Jonathan said, his voice strained. "I received your message. What's all this about? Have you found something?" Harris didn't waste time with pleasantries. "We've uncovered something, Mr. Cartwright," he said, his tone deliberately flat and matter-of-fact. "The evidence points clearly to one of your relatives, someone very close to Emily, someone you may not have suspected." Jonathan's eyes widened, his mouth going dry. "What do you mean? Who?" Harris allowed a pause, letting the tension build. It's clear now that Emily wasn't just looking into family finances. She was uncovering something much darker. We've found that someone was manipulating her, someone who didn't want her to discover the truth. Jonathan's face remained perfectly composed, but Harris could see the faintest twitch in his hand as he clenched and unclenched his fingers. The way his lips quivered ever so slightly as he struggled to maintain his calm only deepened Harris's suspicion. He had seen that reaction before, the slight, unconscious movements of a man on the verge of panic. Jonathan swallowed hard. "Who? Who are you talking about?" Harris studied him for a moment, then said, "We're still gathering all the facts, but the letter, there's something about it that doesn't quite add up. We've been able to connect it to your Aunt Eleanor. Your family has been hiding a lot more than you realize." Jonathan flinched at the mention of Eleanor, and Harris was quick to notice the subtle change in his demeanor. A visible crack. It was enough to confirm that Jonathan knew far more than he was letting on. The mere mention of Eleanor had unsettled him. Why? Was it guilt? Fear? "You don't understand," Jonathan said quickly, his voice rising. "You've got it all wrong. You don't know the whole story. You—" His words trailed off, and for a split second, he looked as though he was about to say something more, but he caught himself. Harris didn't give him the chance to recover. He pressed on, pushing Jonathan to the edge. "You seem awfully defensive, Mr. Cartwright. Are you worried about what we might find?" Jonathan's face was pale now, and the facade he'd worked so hard to maintain was cracking. He had been confident, composed, and now he was unraveling, all because Harris had touched a nerve. The truth was out there, buried beneath the surface of his carefully cultivated story. And Harris had exposed just enough of it to make Jonathan realize that his world was beginning to fall apart. Miss Marple stepped in quietly, her voice calm but piercing. "You've said enough, Mr. Cartwright. It's clear now that you're hiding something. You're not fooling anyone." Jonathan's jaw clenched, but before he could respond, the door opened and another figure stepped into the room. Henley, looking almost as unsettled as Jonathan. The tension in the room thickened as all eyes turned to him. Harris didn't have to say anything. The game had shifted, and Henley's appearance only confirmed what he'd suspected. The pressure was mounting. The pieces were finally falling into place. And now the cracks in their carefully constructed facades were beginning to widen. The truth was slipping through, and no one could hide from it much longer. The room fell silent, thick with tension. Jonathan Cartwright was still, standing there, his face pale and drawn, his composure shattered. The words he had almost spoken, the crack in his mask, had told Harris everything he needed to know. Jonathan was involved, directly or indirectly, in the deception that had entangled the Cartwright family. But before Harris could push further, Henley stepped forward, his face tense. There was something in his eyes, an unmistakable shift in energy, that made Harris pause. Henley was no longer the nervous man who had stumbled through the early days of the investigation. He had become something else, something more controlled, even dangerous in the way he carried himself. "What's going on here, Henley?" Harris asked, his voice sharp, his suspicion rising as he watched the man closely. Henley didn't answer immediately. Instead, his eyes flicked to the desk, where the small evidence box containing the confession letter sat. It had been crucial to their progress, a tangible link, a starting point. "I need to see the letter," Henley said quietly, his voice low, almost too calm. Harris's gaze followed Henley's line of sight to the evidence box, and for a brief moment he thought his mind was playing tricks on him. The box was there, but the letter was gone. "Where is it?" Harris demanded, standing up quickly. "I don't know," Henley replied, his expression unreadable. "You were the one who left it there, Inspector." Harris's pulse quickened. He turned back to Jonathan, his instincts telling him something had gone horribly wrong. The piece of evidence that had driven the case forward, the very thing that tied the Cartwrights to the truth, had vanished. Miss Marple, ever the quiet observer, had been watching all of them carefully. "It seems someone wants to make sure you don't get too close to the truth, Robert," she said softly, her eyes narrowing with an unsettling clarity. "This is no accident." "Someone stole it," Harris muttered, the realization dawning on him. "But why? What's the point of taking it now?" Henley's voice was strained as he attempted to deflect, though his nerves were apparent. "Maybe it was a mistake. Maybe it was misplaced. You know how chaotic this house can be." Harris shot him a glare. "Don't play games, Henley. This isn't a mistake. The letter was there. Just a few minutes ago. It didn't vanish into thin air. Someone took it. And now we're in deeper than ever." Jonathan, who had been standing in the corner, suddenly spoke up, his voice shaky. "You think I took it, don't you? You think I'm the one trying to ruin everything?" Harris turned to him slowly, watching as Jonathan's fingers twitched, betraying his nervousness. "I don't know who took it, Jonathan, but I'm going to find out. I always do." Miss Marple's eyes flicked to Henley again, noting the almost imperceptible shift in his demeanor. "Henley, what aren't you telling us?" Henley looked at Miss Marple, and for the first time Harris saw a flicker of genuine concern in his eyes. "It's not just the letter, is it? You think someone's been working against us from the inside. Someone has been manipulating the situation. All along, haven't they?" Harris didn't need to answer. He could feel it. The sense that they were being toyed with. The pieces they had uncovered, the carefully laid plans, all seemed to be slipping through their fingers. This wasn't just a matter of solving a crime anymore. This was a game of cat and mouse, and the stakes had just escalated beyond what they had expected. "We need to get to the bottom of this," Harris said, his voice cold with determination. The letter wasn't just evidence, it was the key. And now it's gone. Someone's trying to bury the truth before we can expose it. We have to move quickly. He turned to Henley. "Where's the rest of the evidence from the case? The other documents? The reports? We need to check everything now." Henley hesitated, and Harris could see the conflict in his eyes. It was clear that Henley knew more than he was letting on, and whatever knowledge he had, he wasn't willing to share it just yet. "We're not leaving here until we find it," Harris said firmly. "You can either help us, or we can start bringing the police in. Your choice." Henley took a deep breath, clearly struggling with his next move. Finally he spoke, his voice low. "There's something I haven't told you. The letter wasn't the only thing that was taken." Harris felt his stomach tighten. What else was taken? Henley looked around the room, then leaned in closer, his voice barely above a whisper. "The family journals, the records that go back decades, The ones that detail everything, Eleanor's investigation, the family's secrets. They've been removed from the estate. They're gone, Harris. Miss Marple's expression darkened as she absorbed the weight of Henley's words. Someone is erasing history, one page at a time. They're not just hiding the truth. They're trying to rewrite it. Harris's mind raced as he processed the new information. The letter was gone. The journals were gone. What else could be taken to erase the past completely? The pieces were disappearing faster than he could put them together, and it was clear that whoever was behind this wasn't going to stop until the entire Cartwright legacy was buried, along with anyone who dared to uncover it. "We need to find those journals," Harris said decisively. "If someone is trying to erase the truth, they've made a big mistake. They've underestimated us." Henley looked around, his eyes darting toward the door as though expecting someone to burst in at any moment. "You won't find them here," he said quietly. "The journals were taken out of the house hours ago. I tried to stop them, but it was too late. Someone inside the family knew what was happening. They had to have." "Who?" Harris demanded, his voice now a harsh whisper. "Who took them?" Henley didn't answer right away. Instead, his gaze fell to the floor, and when he finally spoke, his words were heavy with the weight of the truth. "Emily. She was the one who took them." The room seemed to close in around Harris. "Emily? You mean she took the journals? Why? Why would she do that?" Henley nodded slowly, his face a mask of regret. "She was scared, Harris. Scared of what she was uncovering. She didn't want anyone to know the full extent of what was going on, what her family had done. She thought she could protect them by hiding it all." Harris took a step back, trying to process the revelation. Emily Cartwright, the missing woman, had taken the journals herself. Had she been trying to shield her family from the truth? Or had she been trying to protect herself from something much darker? The pieces were coming together, but they were more fractured than ever, and every step forward seemed to send them spiraling 2 steps back. But one thing was clear: the game had changed. Whoever was pulling the strings had gone too far, and, now more than ever, Harris couldn't afford to let the truth slip through his fingers. The stakes had risen, and they weren't just playing for answers anymore. They were playing for survival. Harris could feel the pressure building as he left Henley's office, the revelation about the journals still gnawing at the edges of his mind. He had suspected there was more to this case than anyone had let on, but now it was clear. They were dealing with something far more intricate and dangerous than a mere family dispute. The discovery of Emily Cartwright's involvement in hiding the journals only added more weight to the already complex puzzle. As he made his way toward the stairwell, his thoughts racing, the sudden shrill ring of his phone cut through the silence, making his heart jump in his chest. Without hesitation, he answered. "Harris," he snapped, his voice tight. "It's Henley," came the voice on the other end, strained with panic. "You need to get back here, now!" "What is it?" Harris demanded, his steps quickening. His mind was already flashing through the worst possible scenarios. "Emily. She's gone," Henley said, his voice quivering. "Someone broke into the house, right?" "Under our noses. The doors were locked. There's no sign of forced entry, but she's gone. And there's something else. Something worse." Harris didn't wait for Henley to finish. "I'm on my way." The drive back to the Cartwright estate was a blur, the urgency of the call driving him forward, his thoughts churning with dread. What had happened? Why would Emily have disappeared now? Had she been taken? or had she fled on her own? As he arrived, he saw the scene before him. A swarm of officers, the eerie stillness of the house cloaking the investigation. Henley was waiting by the front door, his face pale, his eyes wide with fear. "Harris, this isn't just a missing person," Henley said, his voice barely above a whisper. "We've found a body." The words hit Harris like a blow to the chest. "A body?" he repeated, struggling to process what Henley had said. "Who?" "Upstairs," Henley replied, his eyes darting nervously. "We found Eleanor Cartwright. She's dead." The shock of the statement struck Harris like a thunderclap. Eleanor Cartwright, the matriarch of the family, had been central to this entire investigation. Her cryptic messages, her tangled web of family secrets, it all pointed back to her in some way. But now she was dead, and the carefully laid plans that had been unraveling before him were now completely upended. He followed Henley inside, past the gathered officers, their faces grim. The house felt different now, heavy with something sinister, as though the walls themselves were conspiring to keep its secrets. They led him to the grand staircase, and as Harris ascended, the sight of Eleanor's body sent a chill down his spine. She lay sprawled at the foot of her bedroom door, lifeless and pale, her face twisted in an expression of shock. Blood stained the carpet around her, and the bloodstains were unmistakably fresh. Harris knelt beside her, his trained eyes quickly scanning the scene. There were no signs of a struggle, but the lack of struggle only made the death all the more chilling. It was as if Eleanor had known her fate was coming, as if she had been resigned to it, waiting for the inevitable. "Who found her?" Harris asked, his voice steady despite the turmoil inside. Henley swallowed hard. "I did. I came up here after Emily disappeared. I thought she might be hiding in her room, but when I opened the door, I found Eleanor." Harris turned his gaze to Henley. "And Emily?" Henley's voice trembled. "There's no sign of her anywhere. I thought she might have left, but this changes everything." Harris stood up, his mind whirling with the implications. Eleanor Cartwright had been murdered, and Emily was now missing. But it didn't make sense. If Emily had been behind the disappearance of the journals, why would she suddenly vanish herself? And what was the connection between the two deaths? "What happened, Henley?" Harris asked. "What exactly did you find?" Henley's face was pale, his eyes darting around the room as though seeking answers from the walls themselves. "I don't know. I found her like this. But there's something else, something you need to see." Harris followed Henley into the bedroom, where a small, ornate desk sat against the far wall. Henley gestured to the desk, and Harris felt a strange unease settle in his chest. There, amid the disarray of the room, was a single sheet of paper, a letter. He picked it up, scanning its contents quickly. The handwriting was erratic, the words hastily scrawled, but the message was clear. "You're too late. The truth is already buried. There's nothing left to save. If you want to stop what's coming, you'll have to act fast, but you won't make it in time." Harris's stomach twisted. The letter was a direct threat, a warning, and it wasn't just about Eleanor's death. Whoever had killed her was playing a far larger game, one that was still in motion, one that had yet to reach its deadly conclusion. As Harris turned to face Henley, he realized the truth. This wasn't over. The villain, whoever they were, was still out there, and they had been 2 steps ahead all along. The game had just escalated from an investigation to a race against time. And Emily's disappearance, combined with Eleanor's murder, was only the beginning. "Henley," Harris said, his voice cold, "someone is trying to stop us from uncovering the truth. We're not just dealing with a family in crisis. We're dealing with a killer who's willing to destroy everything to keep their secrets buried." Henley nodded slowly, his face haunted. "What now?" "We keep moving," Harris said, his voice resolute. "We find Emily. We find the journals. And we stop whoever is behind this before they kill again." But as Harris stepped back into the hallway, he couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched, closely, carefully. The shadows that had been closing in on them had only grown darker. The next move was on the killer's terms, and Harris wasn't sure if he could stay ahead. Harris stood motionless, his fingers gripping the edge of the desk as the realization settled heavily in his chest. Emily Cartwright, the missing heiress, hadn't just been a victim caught up in the chaos. She was a willing participant, a key player in the complex dance of deception that had unfolded over the past weeks. But why? What had led her to align herself with a murderer, perhaps even someone close to her? The list on the desk seemed to mock him now, the names on it still swirling in his mind, each one representing a clue, a thread he had yet to fully pull. Benjamin Cartwright, long presumed dead, had returned with a plan that no one had expected, especially not the old, quiet mansion filled with so many secrets. But Benjamin's motives, while dark, were still logical. What Harris couldn't make sense of, however, was Emily's role. He turned to Henley, who had been standing silently behind him, absorbing the weight of his words. "The journals," Harris muttered. "They weren't just about family history. They were about control. Control over the truth." Henley frowned. So Emily wanted the journals to disappear, but why would she help him, Benjamin Cartwright, the brother nobody spoke of? "Exactly," Harris replied, his mind racing. "And that's where the psychology of this case comes in. Something triggered Emily's involvement. Something far deeper than just greed or fear." Henley took a step forward. "You think there's a personal reason? A deeper connection between them?" Harris nodded. "I do, and that connection is the key to understanding everything." He closed his eyes for a moment, piecing together what he knew. Emily had never seemed like the typical victim. She was always calculating, a woman with more than enough means to control her own destiny. But something had shifted in her recently, something that had made her susceptible to whatever Benjamin had promised her. He had come back not just for revenge, not just for money, but for something far more elusive. "Henley," Harris said, his voice steady now, "I believe Emily was never after wealth or power. She was after something far more elusive, a sense of belonging. A family that had long been broken, a love that had been lost." Henley looked confused. "Belonging?" "Yes," Harris continued. "Emily wasn't trying to escape. She was trying to find a way back into a family that had rejected her. Benjamin, despite everything, was the only one who could offer her that. And it wasn't just about him being her brother, though that in itself was a powerful pull. It was about the idea of resurrection, of restoring what had been lost." Henley's gaze softened slightly, but Harris could see the skepticism still lingering in his eyes. "But what's the motive behind all this chaos? Why would Emily kill her own aunt, her own flesh and blood? Why the lies? Why the manipulation? The truth is simpler than we think, Harris said slowly, his eyes locking onto Henley's. Emily didn't kill Eleanor just for inheritance. Eleanor was the last barrier between Emily and her dreams of reclaiming a family that had been shattered for so long. Eleanor stood in the way of her belief in a perfect, unified Cartwright legacy. Benjamin understood that and used it against her. He offered Emily a chance to rewrite history, to become a Cartwright again in the truest sense. But it required sacrifice, and Emily was willing to make it. Henley's face paled. Are you saying she murdered Eleanor out of some twisted need for acceptance? She killed her aunt to create a new family order? Harris nodded grimly. It was about control, Henley. About who had the power to shape the future. For Emily, that meant aligning with Benjamin, even if it meant killing the last, remaining thread to the old Cartwright legacy. She did it for the chance to become part of something larger than herself. Henley stared at him for a moment, the weight of the revelation sinking in. But what about all the lies, the cover-up, the deceit? Emily could have walked away. Could have, Harris said, but she didn't. She was too far gone into the idea of family, of the Cartwright legacy. In her mind, what she did was justified. She didn't just kill Eleanor for money or power. She killed her to prove she could be part of something again. To prove that she could be loved, that she could belong. A silence hung in the air between them, thick with the weight of the truth. And Benjamin, Harris said, his eyes narrowing, he knew exactly how to play her. He promised her something she'd been yearning for her whole life, a place in the family. He had orchestrated everything from the shadows, making her believe that everything she did, every step she took, was to restore balance to the family name. But that doesn't explain everything, Henley said, a thought occurring to him. What about Emily disappearing? Why take herself out of the picture if she was so invested in her plan? Because, Harris answered, she believed she had accomplished what she set out to do. She thought the murder of Eleanor would be the final act in her quest for belonging. She didn't anticipate the consequences, the guilt, the fear. She thought she could walk away and live with her actions, but when she realized the extent of what she had done, the realization came crashing down on her. It wasn't just about the Cartwright legacy anymore. It was about her own fractured sense of self. She couldn't reconcile the person she had become with the family she wanted. Harris paused, the final piece of the puzzle clicking into place. Emily wasn't just running away from the law. She was running from herself. She couldn't live with the monster she'd become in the name of family. She thought she could control everything, but in the end, she lost herself. Henley exhaled slowly, his voice a mix of disbelief and sorrow. A twisted need for acceptance, a family that was never whole. That's why she did it. Yes, Harris confirmed, his gaze hardening. And the most dangerous part of this whole case is that the Cartwright legacy, its hold over them, was never truly about money, revenge, or power. It was about something much darker, the yearning for identity. And in the end, Emily would have sacrificed everything to feel like she belonged. Henley was silent for a long time, the grim truth sinking in. They had uncovered the motive, but there was still so much left to untangle. And though the killer's psychology had been exposed, the road to justice was still long and fraught with danger. Let's find her, Henley said quietly, determination in his voice. We need to bring her back. Harris nodded, his expression resolute. "And we need to stop Benjamin before he turns her into something even worse." The weight of the investigation pressed down on Harris like a suffocating fog. They had finally reached the final piece of the puzzle, but something about the looming confrontation unsettled him. There was a sense of inevitability in the air, something that told him the end was near, but also that it wouldn't come without a final, harrowing twist. He had everything he needed to close the case, yet the air crackled with an unspoken tension. The trap was set. The invitation had been sent, a carefully worded note promising that the truth would finally come to light. Emily Cartwright would be here soon, with nowhere left to run. Benjamin, too, had to know that his carefully laid plans were unraveling. Yet the uncertainty lingered, as it always did in the final moments of a case like this. Harris leaned back in his chair, his fingers drumming lightly against the wooden armrests. Henley paced nearby, his eyes scanning the room as if expecting something to leap out of the shadows. "You really think she'll come?" Henley asked, his voice low. Harris didn't look up. "She will. She thinks she has nothing left to lose, and that's when people make their biggest mistakes." The mansion, though once grand, now felt cold and empty. The chandeliers above cast long, foreboding shadows on the walls. Outside, the wind howled against the windows, a reminder that the storm that had been brewing for days wasn't just a metaphor for the tension between them and the Cartwrights. Henley stopped pacing and fixed Harris with a look. And what about Benjamin? What if he's planning something unpredictable? "He will be," Harris said with a knowing calmness. "But that's what makes this so crucial. Emily is the key. Benjamin is nothing without her. Once we have her, he's finished." Henley nodded, though there was still an uneasy edge to his expression. "And if she doesn't confess? If she tries to run or deny it all?" "We'll be ready," Harris said, his voice quiet but resolute. "We've worked the angles, Henley. The moment she steps into this room, she'll know that we know everything. All that's left is for her to accept it." The sound of footsteps echoed from the hallway. Henley tensed, his hand instinctively reaching for his jacket. Harris raised a hand, signaling for calm. It wasn't the sound of Emily's arrival, but the unmistakable pace of someone else, someone much more dangerous. The door creaked open. Benjamin Cartwright stood in the doorway, his eyes dark and intent, like a predator who had just caught the scent of its prey. There was no mistaking the air of arrogance he carried, nor the palpable threat that lingered in his presence. "You're not going to get her, Harris," Benjamin said, his voice steady and cold. "Not tonight. She's already gone." Harris didn't flinch. "I think you've miscalculated, Benjamin. She'll be here, and when she arrives we'll have everything we need to make sure she faces the consequences of her actions." Benjamin stepped into the room, his movements deliberate. "You still don't understand, do you?" His gaze shifted to Henley. "You think she's the key to all this? She's just a piece of the game. She'll slip through your fingers just like everyone else." Harris stood up, his voice unyielding. "I understand more than you think, and it's over. The game is finished." For a moment they stood there, locked in a silent standoff. Then, without warning, the door creaked again. Emily Cartwright entered, her steps slow and measured. She was calm, almost too calm, as though she had resigned herself to the inevitability of what was coming. Her eyes flicked between Harris and Benjamin, a brief flicker of hesitation crossing her face. "I know why you're all here," Emily said, her voice soft but steady. "But you have to understand, I had no choice." Harris took a step forward, his gaze never leaving hers. "You always have a choice, Emily. You chose to betray your family, and you chose to kill your aunt. You chose Benjamin." A flicker of guilt passed over her expression, but she quickly masked it with defiance. "I did what I had to do. Eleanor was a threat to everything I wanted. The legacy, the Cartwright name, she stood in the way of everything I deserved." Benjamin moved to her side, a shadow falling over her. "That's right. She never understood, never appreciated what it meant to be part of this family. Emily was the only one who saw the potential. She was the one who understood what I had to offer." Emily's eyes shifted uncomfortably, but she didn't speak. "You used her, Benjamin," Harris said, his voice low but piercing. "You fed her lies. You manipulated her into believing she could reclaim a place in the family by murdering your own sister, no less." Benjamin's gaze hardened. "She was weak. Eleanor was a liability. Emily, however, she was my future." Harris took another step closer, his voice unwavering. "The truth has already come out, Benjamin. Your plans have failed. And now, it's time to face the consequences." Benjamin's eyes flashed with fury. "You think you've won? This isn't over. This will never be over." Before Harris could respond, Emily's voice cut through the tension, low but laced with something he hadn't expected. Regret. "It's over, Benjamin. I've seen what I've become, what we've become." The silence that followed was heavy, as though the room itself was holding its breath. Harris knew they were at the crossroads now, the final confrontation. He could see the hesitation in Emily's eyes, the weight of her actions starting to crush her resolve. "You can't escape it, Emily," Harris said softly. "You did what you thought was necessary, but in the end it wasn't. You've already lost everything. You just don't realize it yet." For the first time, a tear welled in Emily's eye. It was small, but it was enough. Enough to show that, beneath the layers of manipulation and self-justification, there was still a human being. A person who understood the magnitude of what she had done. Benjamin took a step toward her, his face twisted with anger. "No, you don't get to walk away. From this, you made your choice." But before he could say more, Henley moved in, his voice sharp. "Benjamin, you're under arrest for conspiracy to murder and aiding and abetting a crime." Benjamin's face twisted into a sneer. "You think I'll go quietly? I'm not finished here." But as he moved, it was clear that he was outmatched. Harris stepped forward, calm and collected, as he read Benjamin his rights. The truth was clear now. Everything was falling apart for the Cartwrights. There was no more room to run. Emily stood frozen, her eyes wide, as though everything had suddenly come into focus. She looked from Harris to Benjamin, and finally back at him, the full weight of her actions crashing down on her. "I didn't want this," she whispered, the words a hollow confession. "I just wanted to belong." Harris's voice softened. "We all want to belong, Emily. But there's a price to pay when we lose sight of what really matters." The tension in the room faded, and though the storm outside raged on, inside, the truth had finally come to light. The case was closed. The tension in the room, so palpable moments ago, had dissipated, replaced by a quiet sense of finality. Benjamin and Emily stood, defeated, caught in a web of their own making. As the officers moved in to cuff them, Harris allowed himself a brief, moment to breathe. It was over, or so it seemed. But Harris had learned long ago that things were rarely as simple as they appeared. Even now, as he watched Emily's face crumble and Benjamin's defiance dissolve, a small, nagging doubt lingered at the back of his mind. He wasn't one for superstition or paranoia, but there was something unsettling about the way everything had unfolded, how smoothly the pieces had fallen into place. It almost felt too perfect. "Take them to the car," Henley said to the officers, breaking Harris's reverie. As the two criminals were escorted out of the room, Henley turned to him, his expression one of mild relief. "It's done, Harris. The case is closed. We can finally rest." Harris didn't respond immediately. Instead, he crossed the room, his eyes scanning the various objects that adorned the walls of the old mansion. The quiet hum of the storm outside seemed to draw his focus, the rhythmic tapping of rain against the windows a counterpoint to the stillness in the room. "Are you sure it's over?" he asked, his voice low, almost to himself. Henley raised an eyebrow. "What do you mean?" "We've got both of them. The motive was clear. "I know," Harris cut him off, turning to face him. "But something doesn't sit right." Henley stepped closer, a frown creasing his brow. "What are you saying? You think they're innocent?" "No," Harris said slowly, shaking his head. "I think they were a diversion." Henley's eyes widened, the sudden shift in his partner's, tones sparking concern. "A diversion? For what?" Harris's gaze remained fixed on the door through which the Cartwrights had been led. The case was wrapped up too neatly. Everything pointed toward them. Too much. And that's exactly what worries me. Henley was about to reply when the sound of footsteps echoed through the hallway again, and a moment later, the door to the study opened. This time, it wasn't the officers, but someone else. Someone who shouldn't have been there. It was Professor Edmund Hale. The distinguished academic had been a trusted advisor to the Cartwright family, a man whose intellect was widely admired. Harris had spoken with him briefly at the beginning of the investigation, but at the time he hadn't made much of an impression. He was a distant figure, well-mannered, polite, but largely uninvolved in the drama that had unfolded between the family members. Now, standing in the doorway, Hale's eyes were wide with a mix of urgency and concern. He was holding something in his hand, something small, wrapped in a piece of cloth. "Detective Harris, I need to speak with you," Hale said quickly, his voice tinged with an emotion Harris couldn't place. Harris's stomach twisted with unease. "Professor Hale, what is it?" he asked, his eyes narrowing. "What are you doing here?" Hale stepped forward, casting a quick glance over his shoulder as though to ensure no one was following him. His eyes flicked to Henley, then back to Harris. I've just come from the study," he said, his voice shaky. "There's something you need to see." Harris's heart rate quickened, sensing that the professor's sudden appearance wasn't a coincidence. "What is it?" Hale didn't immediately respond. Instead, he carefully unwrapped the cloth in his hands, revealing a small, intricately carved box. The wood was old, dark and weathered, with faint markings etched into its surface. The box had been sealed with wax, but the wax had been broken. This was in Eleanor Cartwright's private desk," Hale said quietly, setting the box on the table. "I thought you should know. It seems to tie directly into the case." Harris felt his pulse quicken. His mind raced as he leaned forward, inspecting the box. He hadn't seen it before, and from the way Hale was handling it, he could tell that the professor was just as unsettled by it as he was. "What is it?" Henley asked, stepping closer to the table, his curiosity piqued. Harris carefully examined the box, noting the unusual symbols etched into its surface. He had no idea what they meant, but instinctively he knew that they weren't merely decorative. They were intentional, important. Harris's fingers hovered over the box, but he hesitated. "This isn't just some trinket," Harris muttered, more to himself than anyone else. "It's a clue." Henley looked at him, his brow furrowing. "A clue? To what?" "Eleanor Cartwright didn't die because of some inheritance. She didn't die because of power or jealousy or greed," Harris said, his mind racing. "She died because of something far darker, something hidden beneath all of this, something no one had accounted for." Hale, looking more nervous by the second, stepped back as Harris carefully opened the box. Inside, there was a small piece of parchment, yellowed with age. Harris unfolded it, his eyes scanning the writing, his expression changing as he read. "What is it?" Henley asked again, his voice low. "It's a letter," Harris replied, his voice tight with realization. "A letter from Eleanor Cartwright. But it's not just any letter." The professor stepped forward, his face pale. "What does it say?" Harris looked at the letter one last time, his mind piecing together the revelation that was crashing through him like a flood. "It's a confession," he said slowly. "A confession that Eleanor Cartwright knew everything. That she knew who the real mastermind was all along." Henley's expression shifted. "Who was it?" Harris's eyes flicked to the professor, and the room seemed to freeze. The revelation, when it came, would upend everything. The mastermind wasn't Emily Cartwright. It wasn't Benjamin. It was someone who had been hiding in plain sight the entire time. Someone who had been working with them all along, planting the seeds of deception and manipulation. It was Professor Edmund Hale. Hale's face went pale as Harris spoke his name, the words hanging in the air like a suffocating cloud. His hands trembled, and for a fleeting moment he looked like a man who had been caught in the middle of a storm too fierce to weather. Hale stammered, his eyes darting to the door. "This isn't what you think. You don't understand." "It's not. You don't get to spin your lies anymore, Professor," Harris cut in sharply, his voice unwavering. The realization of it all crashed down on him like a weight he'd been too blind to feel until now. Hale wasn't just involved. He had been the architect of everything. The manipulations, the fabrications, the false clues that had thrown them off track. They were all his doing. "This letter," Harris continued, holding up the crinkled parchment, "was a confession, but not just Eleanor's. It was hers in part, yes, but it was also yours." His fingers tightened around the edges of the paper as he addressed the professor directly. "You thought you could control everything from behind the scenes, didn't you? The inheritance, the power, the family's downfall. You've been pulling the strings, Professor Hale, from the very beginning." Hale's back stiffened, his eyes narrowing in a mix of disbelief and defiance. "You're making a grave mistake, Detective," he said, his voice suddenly cold. "I've spent my life studying the human mind. I know exactly what it takes to manipulate the truth, to shape a narrative. You've only seen part of the picture." Harris stepped closer to the table, his eyes never leaving the professor. "What part of the picture, Hale?" "The part where you use your influence to twist everything, to make people think they're looking at something completely different. The part where you hide behind the family, waiting for them to destroy each other, while you collect the spoils. The professor's eyes shifted momentarily, betraying the slightest flicker of guilt, but it was gone just as quickly, replaced by a veneer of calm. You don't understand, Hale repeated, but his voice was weaker now, as though the very weight of his words was starting to drag him under. Harris didn't flinch. He was close. Now, too close to let this slip away. I understand perfectly, he said, his voice low and commanding. You used Emily, Benjamin, and Eleanor. You manipulated them, played their weaknesses like a maestro conducts an orchestra. But what you didn't count on, Hale, was me. He paused, allowing the silence to stretch between them. I was one step ahead of you all along. The professor's eyes narrowed with renewed anger. You don't know the full story, Harris. You've only scratched the surface. You think I did this for money, for power. You couldn't be more wrong. Harris leaned forward, pressing harder now, refusing to let go. Then tell me why. Tell me why you used them all like pawns. Why the elaborate web of lies? You weren't just after wealth. What did you want, Hale? The professor's gaze flicked to the door again, as though considering escape. But there was nowhere to run. He was cornered. Finally he spoke, his voice barely more than a whisper, raw with the weight of something long buried. It wasn't about money, he said slowly. It was about redemption. He seemed to hesitate for a moment, as though weighing the decision to reveal the truth. You see, Eleanor and I... He stopped, swallowing hard. We were supposed to be together years ago, but she chose him. Hale spat, his bitterness spilling over. She chose Charles, the fool who didn't understand her. I spent years waiting for her to realize the mistake she made. And when the opportunity came, when she was vulnerable, I made sure to push her toward the edge. Harris felt a flicker of recognition. It was the missing piece, the motive that had been so elusive, the real reason behind the cold cruelty Hale had exhibited. This wasn't just about control or wealth. It was personal. This was a man who had carried a grudge for years, simmering in his own bitterness, waiting for the right moment to strike. You thought you could destroy everything, Harris said, his voice steady, despite the storm of emotions churning inside him. That by manipulating Eleanor, by getting her to turn on her family, you could make her regret her choices. You wanted to see her suffer, to feel the loss of everything she held dear. And when it didn't work out, when she started to fight back, you killed her. Hale's lips twitched into something that could almost be mistaken for a smile. It wasn't supposed to go that way, but I never meant for anyone else to get hurt, he said quietly, his eyes hollow. But sometimes things get out of hand. Sometimes you can't control the aftermath. Out of hand? Henley interrupted, his voice thick with disbelief. You killed Eleanor Cartwright, and you're calling it an accident, a casualty of your twisted plans. Hale didn't answer. He stood frozen, looking at the floor as though willing himself to disappear. For a moment, the room was silent, except for the sound of the rain battering the windows. Detective, Hale finally said, his voice small and resigned, I don't expect you to understand, but I do expect you to let me go. Harris's jaw clenched. There was no way Hale was getting out of this. No, he said firmly, his voice cutting through the air like a blade. You're not getting away with this. Not this time. But as the officers stepped forward to take him into custody, a sudden frantic sound echoed through the room, a muffled thud. Harris spun toward the door, just in time to see a figure darting down the hallway, their silhouette barely visible through the darkness. "Damn it!" Harris muttered, instinctively reaching for his gun. Henley shouted for backup, but Harris was already moving, racing down the hallway after the fleeing figure. He knew deep down that the truth hadn't been fully exposed. Not yet. There was someone else involved, someone who had been orchestrating everything from the shadows. He followed the figure into the darkness, his footsteps loud against the empty floor. The chase was on, and in that moment, the unfinished business, the lingering doubts, began to unravel at last. The rain had slowed to a soft drizzle by the time Harris reached the end of the corridor, his breath sharp and ragged from the chase. His shoes slapped against the stone floor, the echo of his hurried steps bouncing off the walls, a reminder that the game was far from over. The figure he had been pursuing had vanished into the labyrinth of narrow alleyways and shadows, slipping away like a ghost into the night. His heart raced, a mixture of frustration and anticipation gnawing at him. For all his experience, he couldn't shake the sense that he had missed something small, yet significant. There was a whisper in the back of his mind that refused to be quieted, a detail he had overlooked in the midst of the frenzy, a piece of the puzzle that didn't quite fit. He paused for a moment at the end of the hall, his hand resting against the cool stone of the wall. The air was thick with tension, and in the silence, it was almost as if the whole building held its breath, waiting for the next move. Harris closed his eyes for a brief second, his mind racing back to the moment when Hale had confessed. The Kai. Pieces had fallen into place, but there was something about the professor's final words that nagged at him. "I never meant for anyone else to get hurt." The words echoed in his mind like a haunting refrain. It didn't make sense. Hale had been cold, calculating, his actions deliberate. But the way he had spoken those words, so raw and vulnerable, didn't match the man Harris had come to understand. It was almost as if there was something more beneath the surface, something the professor hadn't revealed. Harris pushed the thought aside, shaking his head. He couldn't afford to be distracted. The truth was close. Hale's confession, the chase, the confrontation, it was all coming together. And yet, something still lingered, a shadow in the corner of his mind. He turned and made his way back toward the investigation room, his pace steady but deliberate. As he entered, he was met by Henley, who looked up from the scattered case files on the table. "Any luck?" Henley asked, his voice a mix of concern and expectation. Harris shook his head. No sign of him. He vanished into the storm. Henley nodded, his face drawn with the weight of their unfinished business. "Do you think he'll come back, or is this it?" Harris didn't answer right away. Instead, he moved over to the table, his eyes scanning the array of papers, photographs, and notes laid out before him. The case had seemed so clear-cut just hours ago, but now, with Hale's flight and the uncertainty that still lingered, Harris couldn't help but wonder if they had missed something crucial. A flicker of movement caught his attention. It was a small detail, tucked away in the corner of a photograph, a scrap of paper, barely visible but unmistakable. It was a matchbook, the kind found in cheap motels or dive bars, bearing the faded logo of a place Harris knew all too well, the Crown and Anchor, a pub in Whitechapel. The connection was immediate, a thread weaving its way back through the case. Harris's mind clicked into overdrive. The Crown and Anchor. It had been a place mentioned in passing during one of the witness interviews, a name that hadn't seemed important at the time. But now it took on new meaning. He leaned closer, studying the photograph more carefully. The matchbook was not just a throwaway detail, it was a clue, and its placement in the photograph was intentional. It was a breadcrumb, one that Harris was now determined to follow. The Crown and Anchor, he realized, was not just a random location. It was a place where secrets had been exchanged, where deals had been made, and where the threads of this entire mystery had started to unravel. He turned to Henley, his voice calm but urgent. "We need to go to Whitechapel now." Henley raised an eyebrow, but didn't question the urgency. "You think this will lead us to Hale?" "I don't know," Harris admitted, his mind still racing. "But it's our only lead. If there's one thing I've learned, it's that nothing in this case was ever what it seemed." As they left the office, Harris felt the weight of the case settle on his shoulders once again. The Crown and Anchor. He couldn't shake the feeling that this was where the final pieces of the puzzle would fall into place. But as they made their way through the rain-soaked streets toward Whitechapel, he couldn't escape the nagging sense that something was still missing. Something that had eluded him just out of reach. The streets of Whitechapel were as dark and silent as ever, the flickering lamplights casting long shadows across the wet pavement. Harris and Henley moved quickly, their footsteps muffled by the soft patter of the rain. The Crown and Anchor loomed ahead, its crooked sign swaying gently in the wind, a reminder of the twisted path they had taken to get here. They entered the pub cautiously, the door creaking as they stepped inside. The place was nearly empty, save for a few lone figures hunched over their drinks. The air was thick with smoke, and the dim light gave everything an almost otherworldly quality. Harris's eyes scanned the room, his instincts telling him that the answers they were looking for were hidden somewhere in the murky depths of this place. But as his gaze fell upon the bartender, a burly man with a face that seemed to have been carved from stone, something in the back of his mind clicked. The bartender was familiar. Harris had seen him before, but where? The man looked up from polishing a glass, his eyes meeting Harris's. There was a flicker of recognition, but it quickly vanished behind a mask of indifference. "What can I get you?" the bartender asked gruffly. Harris didn't respond immediately. Instead, he leaned against the bar, his fingers tapping rhythmically on the wood. "We're looking for someone. A man named Hale. Ever heard of him?" The bartender's hand froze, the glass momentarily suspended in mid-air. For a split second, Harris saw the briefest flash of something in the man's eyes, fear, guilt. It was gone almost immediately, replaced by a practiced nonchalance. "No, can't say I've heard of him," the bartender muttered, his tone too flat, too rehearsed. Harris didn't buy it. He could feel the tension in the air, thick and oppressive. And as he stood there watching the man's every move, he realized that they weren't the only ones being hunted. Hale wasn't just running from them. He was running from something far more dangerous, something deeper than anyone had anticipated. As Harris turned to leave, Henley at his side, the weight of the moment settled heavily on him. The Crown and Anchor had been a dead end, but the question remained, who was really pulling the strings here? Who was the one orchestrating this twisted game? Harris couldn't shake the feeling that the answers were out there, just beyond his reach. The rain had stopped by the time they stepped back into the street, but the air felt charged, as if the storm wasn't quite over yet. And as they walked into the night, the mystery seemed to deepen, the shadows growing longer, stretching into a future that was still uncertain, still filled with more questions than answers. The case was far from finished, and Harris, ever the detective, knew it. The truth was always just one step ahead.